All right, well, that's the top of the hour. So good morning to all of our attendees calling in from across North America. And we've got quite a crowd here from around the globe. So if you're calling in from Europe or somewhere else, good afternoon and good evening. Welcome to today's webinar from the ReadTech Life Sciences team and our friends at Prisym ID, UDI and the EU MDR, what you need to know to comply. Before we begin, I'd like to let everyone know we will be recording today's session and we'll email a copy of the presentation slides with the recording link within the next few days. Usually takes us a few days to get that recording and edit it, but it will be available to you. Also, we'll have a live Q&A following the presentation, so please submit questions anytime throughout today's event. Please just be sure to use the Q&A module and not the chat module. That way I'll be sure to see your question come in and pull it together with the other ones. Our presentation today will begin with a high-level overview of the EU MDR in general. Then we'll look more closely at the UDI requirements contained within the EU MDR. We'll then share with you some of the most important lessons we've learned from helping medical device clients comply with the labeling and data aspects of UDI in the U.S., all of which you should keep in mind as you build your EU UDI compliance program. To conclude the presentation portion of today's event, we'll give you some things to consider when selecting labeling and data solutions for UDI. And finally, as I mentioned, we do have time reserved following the presentation to answer your questions, so please submit those using the Q&A module anytime during today's event. Our cast today, in order of appearance, includes Chris Lentz. He's the VP of SaaS Business Development at Prisym ID. Chris manages the SaaS Cloud Solutions team and maintains relationships with customers to ensure ongoing feedback and development. He works closely with a GXP-focused cloud provider and Prisym ID's test and validation experts to deliver compliance-oriented solutions for the life sciences sector. Chris has more than 25 years of experience in enterprise software solutions and holds a Master of Science in Computing for Commerce and Industry. Our second presenter today is Gary Stainer. Gary is Senior Manager of Information Solutions on the ReadTech Life Sciences team. He's a subject matter expert on UDI and other structured content submissions to regulatory agencies. Gary has over a decade of experience in the life sciences industry and has worked for more than 30 years in the areas of software development, process management, and data conversion. We also have with us today Phil Dre. He's Senior Test and Validation Engineer at Prisym ID. Phil's here to help us answer your questions during the Q&A portion. He oversees regulatory compliance with FDA, MHRA, EU, and GMP requirements for life sciences software products. Phil also ensures alignment of validation documents and processes with current regulatory guidance and provides on-site training for Prisym ID's life sciences products. He has over 24 years of experience on the Prisym ID team, working in the areas of electronics, computing, and customer support. And now, if our panelists are ready, we'll turn things over to Chris to begin our first section.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. Thanks for the introductions, and good afternoon, good morning to everybody listening in. We wanted to start the session today by just providing a very high-level overview of EU MDR and what it is. I suspect that most people on the call will already know some of this information, but it does help to kind of set the scene, provide us context for the rest of the presentation. So I guess the first question is, what exactly is EU MDR? It basically it's a new set of regulations which the European Commission is introducing. They're repealing a number of previous medical device directives. Directives are slightly less stringent and slightly less strict than regulations. Regulations pass into law immediately once they're applicable. So by introducing these new regulations, already the fact that there are regulations indicates how keen the EU is to tighten up on these things. It's a consequence of a number of recent events which highlighted weaknesses in the previous framework that were being used to manage and control the distribution of medical devices across the EU, which were harmonized back in the 1990s, so it probably was time for them to be replaced. What it brings with it, EU MDR brings with it a lot more scrutiny of technical documentation. It addresses concerns over the assessment of product safety and performance by placing stricter requirements on the clinical evaluation aspects and post-market clinical follow-up for products and devices in the market. So there's a requirement for better traceability of devices throughout the supply chain. These new regulations are applicable across all member states of the EU, and that does include the UK. The expectation is that the UK will retain the same standards as the EU, particularly in aspects like medical devices. And there are changes that will impact anyone designing, manufacturing, testing, approving, and marketing medical devices into the EU. So it's actually going to be necessary for manufacturers to complete somewhat of a gap analysis of the requirements of the EU over what they've implemented for other regulatory authorities such as the FDA. And that's kind of part of what we're actually also highlighting here, is how you can use what you've already done for the FDA to help you move forward with EU MDR. In terms of the key changes, there are a number of changes, and these are changes in comparison to the previous medical device directives, of course. So these are specific changes that the new regulations bring in. There's a whole new set of notified bodies that need to be designated. So they have a new role. These bodies are not yet in place. The process of designating those has actually started in November this year. So that's a fairly major aspect there. Products will need to be registered under the new regulations. So in effect, products which are already registered under the directives will need to be registered again under the regulations. Some products may need to be reclassified. Others may need clinical re-evaluation. There's a whole raft of changes that companies need to be aware of. One of the key things, obviously, from the perspective of today's discussion is all products will now need the UDI identification and registration, very similar to what's being required in the FDA UDI initiative. So what's happening, of course, is there's a number of issues that need to be addressed. The timelines, as we'll see in a second, the timelines are actually very, very challenging. There are requirements on resources, systems that might be needed. There's also an opportunity here for organizations that have a number of products classified under or registered under the medical device directives to maybe take a look at their portfolio. Maybe not all of them need to be carried over under MDR, so there's an opportunity here for organizations to maybe do a bit of streamlining of their product portfolios as well. We'll look at a quick look at the timeline here. We're obviously, right now, we're in the bottom left-hand corner, around about November this year, about the time that notified bodies have started to be designated. The regulations themselves, we mentioned MDR and IVDR here. The conversation we're having today, we're mostly talking about medical device regulations, but there are parallel regulations for in vitro diagnostic devices as well. Very similar timelines. So we're putting both of them onto this timeline here. The regulations came into force for both in May this year. There is a transition period, as you can see, going up through the timeline. There's the launch of the new UDI database, so the database into which all the UDI registrations will need to be made. That's expected to come in March. So that's a little way off, but there's still a lot of work to be done to be ready for that. May 2020 is when the new regulations actually come into application. So after that date, anything has to be done under the new regulations. So some key dates, for example, the latest date at which you'll be able to put devices into market that are registered under the medical device directives is going to be the 26th of May 2024. The latest date for putting any of those devices into service will be a year later, 26th of May 2025. So you can see from here there is a very prescribed time frame. And it depends on the type of device that we're talking about, how the time frames apply after the regulations have come into application. So again, similarly to the FDA UDI, where the different classes of devices were given different deadlines to be compliant. Depending on the risk category of the devices, you have between 1 and 5 years after the date of the laws becoming applicable to get those devices registered into the UDI, and so you can place them on the market. So with that brief look at the timelines, I'd like now to hand back to Gary, who will take us into more detail of what the regulations requirements are going to be.
Thank you, Chris. And just before Gary begins as we're switching presenters, I'll remind everyone, please submit your questions anytime throughout the presentation. You don't have to wait till the end. And please use the Q&A module to do so, not the chat module. Thanks. Gary?
Well, thank you, Dan and Chris. Welcome all. What we'll do now is take a look at some of the details of the UDI requirements regarding data and labeling. This is a huge topic in medical device regulation, and IVDR, as Chris had mentioned, has quite a range of scope. Certainly don't have enough time to go into all those details today, but we're going to focus in on just the UDI activities and how it affects your data management and your labeling activities. But before we get started there, I just want to couch the conversation. I have a couple slides here about what is happening across the world. There's a number of global activities regarding UDI. The International Medical Device Regulatory Forum back in 2013 put some put a UDI guidance out in place. They do other activities, but this particular one is noteworthy for this conversation. And then in 2016, they released a common data elements document. This is a group of regulators that has gotten together and agreed on a general roadmap. It's not binding, but it does influence the activities of individual regulatory bodies across the globe. About that same time frame, in the 2013 time frame, FDA released their regulation on UDI, and that's obviously had a scheduled delivery and implementation. The Class 3s and Class 2 products and implants and life-sustaining, life-supporting are all recorded and active. Their compliance states have been in the past. Outstanding is the Class 1 devices, moving out to 2020 now. But most recently, and for a conversation today, 2017, as Chris had mentioned, the EU released their regulations on MDR and IVDR. There was at one point in time a thought that there might be one big, large global database that would cover all this information, and there'd be various parties participating and contributing. That does not appear to be the case. So what will most likely be reality is that various regulatory bodies will have their own independent data, and yet there'll be core information that would be found in each one of these repositories, and obviously some sharing of application reviews and so on. But the game plan, as we see it, is that there'll be a convergence of these regulatory bodies and information and standards, but not full and complete harmonization. And then quickly, as we take a look around the world map, we see that the U.S. and EU have announced their timing. Netherlands has actually jumped on board as well. And then there's other significant activities along the UDI lines in China and Canada and Saudi Arabia and Taiwan, Turkey, and so on. This list is quite large and it's growing. So we see that there's a number of regulators at this point that have already indicated a UDI timeline. Many of these will be announcing a similar type of guideline going forward. So what we'd like to do now, though, is take a more detailed look at the FDA UDI and the European Union UDI. The first category there as to goals is pretty much the same. If you were to read guidance and regulations for both of these parties, they very much the same: improve safety and make it much more accurate and efficient to identify products and so on, decrease counterfeits, and basically have a system in place for more accurate event reporting and corrective actions and so on. There's a number of custom business rules. Surprisingly, there are a lot that are shared, and again, that kind of flows down from the fact that both have, in concept, bought into the IMDRF guidelines. At this point, issuing agencies are the same, so the GS1, HIBIC, and ICC BBA are all issuing agencies or entities, as it's referred to as in the EU guidance. Data elements, there's 64 data elements that are recorded in the database at the FDA. The FDA Good ID has a number of those attributes along with the device identifier. At this point, the EU regulation identifies 40, so a little bit less. I do expect that perhaps to grow as the implementing acts come into place. They also have identified a concept of basic UDI, DI, and this is a particular attribute that gets reported very early on in the registration of the product. It's not fully identified. There's actually a lot of discussion from industry and to actually figure out what this particular field is, how it would be used, and so on. But that is a new concept, different from what is in place with the FDA UDI. Submissions, electronic submissions, there's a manual option for the FDA. I have not seen a similar option for EU. There's Health Level 7 Structured Product Labeling, SPL, electronic message implemented for the FDA. It's referred to in EU. I don't believe it's finalized at this point. Still a lot of discussion on what the actual format will be. UDI is a huge change for the EU that has a number of different systems all linked together with public data available, so and able to be downloaded. So this is going to be quite a change from what we now know as UDI, and obviously the labels will be included, including the UDI values on them. So there's a number of other things, and what we'll do now is take a look at a very quick overview. So if you had been working with FDA, there's a lot of similarities. You know that UDI had to be placed on the label in a human readable and an automatic format. For those devices that were multiple use and reprocessed, there were some direct marking requirements. There's requirements to report the data to the FDA Good ID database, and there was ongoing reporting for annual reports and recalls and so on. If you look at this chart, you'll see it very similar as we move over to the EU. So again, there's requirements to identify the device with a device identifier. Again, there's two components, a device ID and a product ID making up the full UDI. So that needs to be, again, on the package of, of the product itself and the package in various formats. So the technology there is AIDC, either a barcode or RFID type of tag is typically used. And then there's a direct marking concept. Now for reusable devices, there's a database, which we had alluded to earlier, for storing and managing this information, making it publicly available. And there's also reporting a lot of post-marketing surveillance and other type of activities where UDI would be included. So as you take a look at a very high level, there is a lot of similarities in what the EU regulation has to say. If you have been working and implementing FDA UDI, then you're pretty far along in understanding basic concepts as you move into EU. If you have not, there's a significant amount of documentation available on the regulations, and there's a considerable amount of homework, but there is a lot of information available. What we'll do now is take a look at some of the UDI rule comparisons. There are many rules that are the same, and certainly the majority of those are the same as you look at the FDA and EU. Ones I put out here and selected are different. So these are types of things that you find when you start to go into the details. Things are slightly different. In some cases, they use the same terms, but it has a little bit different context and so on. I'll just highlight a couple here. We won't dive into each one of those. But the existing inventory, the FDA had a concept of a 3-year inventory extension. The EU does not have such a concept regarding inventory, although they do have the transition period that Chris had mentioned earlier. The other, and I'll mention, is going down near the bottom, a Class 1 requirement where the FDA exempted the production identifier from being included in the UDI across the board for all Class 1 products. That concept was not carried through in the EU. So I put this together so that you can kind of see that there's subtle differences, but you will need to work your way down through each of these concepts to be fully compliant. This slide is pretty busy. I understand that. We won't go into, obviously, each of those characteristics and data elements on the left, but the point I wanted to make at this slide is that there are a number of data sets regarding medical devices and standards that are being adopted. So the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum UDI guidance and their common data elements are the first 2 columns in gray there, 2 regarding the FDA Good ID and the SPL, the green referring to the European Commission MDR and IVDR. Those 2 columns are actually very close, except there are some subtle differences. And then for those companies that are marketing product in England, so there's National Health Service e-procurement activity going on. So for comparison, that information is also charted, as well as some companies are being asked to supply data through a commercial venue, GS1 Global Data Synchronization Network, and that's actually much fuller data set. So this is one of 10 slides. They're in the appendix. We won't be going any further than this slide, but it does require a significant amount of detail, analysis. Sometimes the terms are very similar, and you think you have the data value, but yet you will need to read the actual definitions and see that in some cases it could be different. Definitely some common fields, and then there are some unique fields. As to the impacts to the labeling, there's a complete chapter in the MDR and IVDR regarding the content that appears to be on labels. Much of that is similar to what has been in place with the directive in the past. These are some items that are new or have seen some changes. So a couple to highlight here: a medical device indicator, being able to indicate whether it's a single-use, reprocessed single-use device, and so on. Chris, if you want to take a second and just jump in here and mention any of one of these that you see are significant and might be noteworthy for the audience.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I mean, obviously there are a number of new requirements, as you say. There's some, that are worth pointing out. Things like warnings, for example, residual risks for vulnerable patients. So, for example, if there are substances used as part of the device, you need to have warnings that carry the risk that may be for maybe pregnant women or for young children and so on. Some new symbols from different symbols. The medical device indicator itself is a new symbol. We don't seem to have had that defined finally yet, but the expectation is it will be similar to the current IVD indicator. So, yeah, a number of things. But one that's quite interesting that is worth pointing out is the kind of under the electronic labeling or the EIFUs area, there's also a requirement now that if the manufacturer has a website, then the information about the device itself needs to be made available on that website and importantly kept up to date on the website. So if there are changes to the device, you have to keep your websites up to date as well. So, I mean, basically each device is going to need to be accompanied by the information needed to identify the device, so that's no surprise. But the amount of information required and the places where it needs to be, a lot of complex requirements here. And of course, the other thing with the EU is often the requirement for multiple languages as well.
Yeah, well, thank you, Chris. I think what we've seen is some new requirements are now in place. We'll look at some of the lessons learned going forward in the next section, but just as a quick glance at looking at some of these, the continual problem of finding real estate on the label to include this information is going to be a challenge. So redesigning labels and getting everything in place with available space is going to be a real challenge. So Chris, I think you're up next to cover some things about lessons learned from the FDA and how we can apply it to the EU.
I'll also just mention as we're transitioning, we are getting some questions, but please continue to submit them. We'll get to as many as we can during the Q&A time.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Gary. Yeah, so what we wanted to do as well as part of this is to share some insights that we picked up from talking to customers that have been through the UDI implementation, or the FDA UDI implementation process, and pass some of those anecdotes back to you and sort of roll them up in terms of a number of lessons. The first one, and these are in no particular order, but the first one is really just to don't wait. You know, the experience that we had, or that we gathered from our customers, is that underestimating how long this will take is quite a common mistake. So often the time for things like data collection has taken longer than expected, overall implementation for things like systems planning, etc., taking much longer than expected. And an additional issue was the fact that the impact that UDI was going to have on the business was not fully understood. And as the project developed, more and more people from different departments wound up being sucked into it, and more people being involved than was expected. So where the organization had spent some time building a team ready for the implementation, that the typical findings that they had a much more effective result for their rollout. So really, the lesson that we take away from this is that, you know, UDI, EU MDR has more complexity than the FDA UDI. Not the least because of the fact that it's you know, European Union wide, and it's not just the EU. It also applies to all the individual member states, and some of the member states may have slightly different nuances as well. So there's a lot of complexity in there because of the size of the region and the differences across the region that have to be taken care of. So really, the lesson here is get on with it as soon as you can, start as early as possible, plan your resources, both internal and external. One of the key things here as well is that you may need to get your suppliers involved. Making them aware early on that you're doing this project is a way to make sure that you can get a commitment from them before they get too committed on other projects, which is, again, something which we found customers experienced. Second lesson we took away is that some companies were considering this to be just a labeling issue, but as you know, Gary has pointed out in his section just now, you know, this is also an awful lot about data. Labeling is part of it, data is an even bigger part of it. So categorizing it as just a labeling problem, you know, some companies were thinking they could just implement a new label design package and that would solve all their problems, but of course that doesn't address the data requirements. Some companies identified it as a label design and regulatory issue and maybe set up a project to deal with each of those separately. But as we said earlier, where the companies viewed the FDA UDI requirement as a cross-discipline or cross-departmental problem, that's where the implementations were most successful, bringing the different skill sets in from the different groups within the organization, for example, involving people from production, people from QA. They bring their different experiences, their different knowledge, and they can share that across the team. So having an understanding of each department and a good overview of the business is going to be very important to ensure that the selected solution actually delivers the required results. So as you move and start embarking on your EU MDR implementation, really start to think about which departments are going to be involved. It's not just going to touch the people that do the labeling. The third lesson is around ensuring that your systems are suitable for the implementation that you're planning, and you need to do this. This is definitely something you need to do as early as possible. It may be that some of your systems old processes are not really capable of meeting the new requirements. For FDA UDI, we found some companies needed new systems, they had to have systems updated, additional validation requirements, additional training and so on, so again, all takes time. New partnerships are required, for example, with suppliers of submission solutions, and standard operating procedures, that's a big part of it, needed to be changed or adapted to make sure that the new requirements were captured and embedded into the company's processes. An example is one of the changes required for FDA UDI was around the GTINs, and the need for a GTIN on each different level of packaging, and in some cases the device data was designed to only have a single identifier, so the data model being used by the organization didn't really fit these multiple GTINs. So, maybe new systems had to be brought in, or maybe there was a requirement to store data in different systems. So perhaps the production data stored in an existing manufacturing system, but the new GTINs are stored and maintained only in the labeling. So there needs to be an efficient data processing and data management approach so that you can reuse common data for the submissions to the regulators, either for EU MDR, FDA UDI, whatever comes ahead in the future, but also ensuring that data is synchronized across your systems and in your labeling system. So integration was another issue. Consider the requirements for integration across the systems. If you've got a single source of truth, but where you hold all your data, does that single source of truth offer easy access to the data for integration with other systems? And finally on here, you need to actually consider what you do have already. So, having said that maybe your systems can't deal with the changes, it might be that they can, you just don't know it because you don't use all of the applications and systems that you've got. So it's worth spending some time looking at what you have, reviewing the processes and systems that you have, spend some time talking to your suppliers because they know the applications and systems better than anyone, and they should be aware of the requirements of EU MDR and whether their technologies and their systems can deal with it. Getting the suppliers on board early is also a very good idea. Fourth lesson is really around the data itself. So ensuring that data is reliable, having consistent and reliable data is obviously a critical aspect to this. Some of the findings we had here was that people that were spoken to were not very confident in the data that they were provided with or they had access to. So quotes, for example, the data's often wrong, so we don't use it. We've been waiting for the data to be corrected, and we can't meet our performance targets. Other systems are unusable at certain times of day. So, that was one example where a company's ERP system was, in theory, available 24 hours a day. But if you were working in the manufacturing plant in the Republic of Ireland, when the US office started work, there was no response time to the system, so it became unusable. So you need to understand the data model as well, where the data is stored, how it's maintained, and when it comes to modifying the systems to support additional requirements, you need to understand how to actually continue to maintain that data. So ensuring that your solution allows you to get the data into the system to meet the current requirements, but also that it can be maintained in a way that meets the requirements of all consumers of the data. So it's not just, the individuals in a specific department that need this data. Lots of people across the organization are going to need access to the data. Gary, I don't know if you have any additional observations that you'd like to make on the data side, as it's clearly an area that you're very interested in.
Sure. Let me add a couple comments. Good review of the approach of many of our customer clients as they started to manage data. It was usually the case that everyone kind of thought their data was in pretty good shape when they embarked on the FDA UDI activities. A couple weeks later, they soon realized that their data was not as clean as what they thought it was. It was, in many cases, lacking some fields that need to be collected. In many cases, the data was scattered about into various different locations and silos. Many times the formats were not as needed to be submitted to the agency. So there was a lot of cleansing and verification and audit of the data itself. In many cases, some of our clients valued the ability to do a pre-check before it was actually submitted to the agency. So going through multiple iterations of the data set and the records, so we're talking about numerous fields, 55 fields along with the device identifier that need to be collected for each device. The other thing that came up was that there was some confusion about applying the device identifiers to each of the various products and packaging, so it wasn't as easy and clear as originally thought, and I think you mentioned that in your particular case as well, Chris. And one of the takeaways was that in many cases it was wise to have data owners assigned to various attributes. So since this is not a one-time activity, being able to have an owner keep an eye on the data and then report when it's changed and basically, be the steward for that particular data set. These are a couple of things that we have encountered in working with the FDA data, and we expect similar type of experiences as people start to pull and manage the data for the EU MDR.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Gary, for that information. And then if we move on to the final lesson, which is lesson 5, is basically be ready for continued change. I mean, adopting UDI can be an opportunity. So it can be used for more than just complying with the latest set of regulations. So some of our customers have used it as an opportunity to review their entire product branding, to standardize on packages, layout and style of labels and so on, in order to kind of consolidate and streamline how they operate so that they can meet these requirements, and also know that they can easily adapt to new requirements for different UDIs from different regions as they come on board. It's enabled them to implement new systems that do allow them to adapt for those future changes without that impact, without the same impact that they had on them when they implemented FDA UDI. And EU MDR obviously offers a similar type of opportunity for those organizations that haven't been through the FDA UDI process. Timescales are obviously an issue. Timescales required to make the changes necessary are not achievable in the time frame that the FDA required. So in some cases where a very kind of complex and long-term solution was planned, in order to ensure that that target was ultimately reached, short-term workarounds were put in place for dealing with immediate requirements so that the long-term solution wasn't compromised. So taking shortcuts to meet some immediate deadline might sound like a good idea at the time, but is that going to compromise the long-term sustainability of the final solution? So think about the kind of long-term here. It is a long-term game, and the key lesson here is that these changes, the EU MDR, they're not going to be the last changes. So we can't expect these to be the last regulatory changes. At the moment, it's a very reactionary culture, and we can expect to see further changes from further regions, even maybe from the EU and the FDA themselves. So implementing a solution designed to help deal with those changes and ensuring that you're well positioned to manage those as they come on board. A well-implemented solution can give you a competitive edge, of course. If you put systems in place for FDA UDI, think about how satisfactory the results were. Did it deliver what you wanted it to deliver? Are there opportunities to whether the systems that you put in place for FDA UDI can be improved using the same approach that you use for FDA UDI? If the results were not as satisfactory as you would like them to have been, if you use that same approach for EU MDR, the chances are that you'll have similar results. So making an improvement to the way that you do things, whether it's the processes, the solutions, the methods, or whatever, that can yield significantly better results this time round. There ends the last lesson. Gary, I'll hand back to you now.
Yeah, let me add one quick comment in regarding the ongoing change. We have seen those clients that approach this as a process with maintenance and rather than a one-time project, been much more successful in being able to accommodate, the changes that we've actually seen. our data shows that roughly 30% of the data that has been submitted to the FDA has been changed and modified. So, there's evidence that it indicates that this is not a one-time submission. We actually expect that to go up. The FDA is currently in the middle of a quality improvement for Class 3 and Class 2 devices records that are in place, and we'll have some guidances that will cause some updates. So it's very important to have change management for corrections of the values, to handle new versions and models, and also new products. So we have seen, the takeaway here is that if you target efficient data processing and a management approach that can reuse common data for submission across global regulatory activities and other trading partners, and put labeling infrastructure in place that can be flexible, you're preparing yourself for the global roadmap, and I think that's very significant as we see what these particular regulatory activities have done and how they're rolled out. So, Dan, do you want to?
Sure, I'll just mention we have a lot of great questions coming in. We're going to get to as many of them as we can. You can keep submitting them, and let's move on to our next section so we have enough time for Q&A.
Very good. So we'll take a couple minutes to include a quick overview of the solutions that RETEC and Prisym ID offers. We've included these in an integrated graphic on the screen that you now see, with your data being stored in various locations over on the left-hand side. So the medical device manufacturer has a number of systems in place, product lifecycle management, master data management, enterprise resource planning, and regulatory systems, and so on. I'm going to talk primarily about the data that runs across the top horizontal data flow. That would be the UDI data set. So in the case of the EU, this would be about a 40 or so data value in record, and we have a system in place. Our data systems are able to accommodate that data on electronic input feed, and be able to manage that data, do the validation, being able to do some pre-checks, apply the business rules of the agency to make sure everything's in place, look at the formatting, and then build that submission record that needs to be sent off, and then manage any feedback from a regulatory agency. I'll also mention at this point the system is flexible, where there can be a data value that is sent to the regulatory agency. There's other systems that are able to take data and send it off to trading partners through that global data synchronization network that we had mentioned earlier. So many of your downstream customers are looking for data that includes UDI and other attributes, and then ultimately out to the public. So, that information is available in various databases. I think, Chris, if you want to talk and just give an overview of that lower data flow, which is more directed toward the actual label that goes on the product and packaging.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Gary. Obviously, the source data can typically come from the same applications. There'll be information held in the PLM system or the ERP system. So the left-hand side clearly is very similar for the data that we're using for labeling. Some of the data itself may be different. There will be commonality of data, but we're focused really on our piece about the information that's going to be on the labels or the data associated with labels. But it's a very similar kind of flow that Gary discussed. The information comes out of the source application. We store the necessary information inside the labeling system, applying all the necessary controls and checks and balances and so on for approvals of the labels, the designs, the data content, etc. Ultimately, for that information to appear as required by the various UDI requirements on the labels themselves. One of the interesting things shown here, though, is the link between the two data streams. So you'll notice the vertical dotted line between Prisym and RETEC there. The reason for that is that clearly UDI data has to be very synchronized, what's submitted to the regulatory body, regulatory agency, has to be what's actually appearing on your labels as well, clearly. So the idea here is that you can use an interface between these two systems to actually ensure that the data that is submitted to the UDI database is synchronized with the information that's held in the labeling system itself. So you know that when that data goes onto the label and ultimately going right to the right-hand side of the diagram out to the end user or the patient, then that data synchronization can be assured.
Very good. I think what we'll do now is take a quick look at some of the features and values that are provided by the various systems. To quickly summarize the left-hand side, we talked about the capability to do data normalization and validation and management and all in a compliance system with audit trails and so on, and then being able to communicate that data, package it, and send it off to the agency as well as to customers. This particular model can be implemented either in SaaS with our hosting here or as an outsourced service where we do the work on your behalf. The system is scalable and non-intrusive, so it's very flexible in connecting to your particular systems so they can remain in place, and this doesn't overtake or cause you to do a heavy implementation at your site. Connectors are in place to pull that data and retrieve that and transfer data to our system. And then the last bullet there, certainly you want to look at something that has a global roadmap as UDI is being implemented around the globe. Chris, I hand it back over to you to just quickly summarize the Prisym features and values there.
And quickly indeed, thanks Gary. Yes, I mean the strengths of the Prisym system are really around the compliance aspect. So the controls, the traceability, the auditability, but the fact that the platform itself is qualified, and we provide the documentation that goes with it. So it helps to ensure that this compliance is readily achievable by the customers. Again, clearly scalable and configurable. So, you know, we have a number of different deployment options. We have an SME targeted SaaS deployment. You can go on-premise, or you can go the hosted cloud solution as well. So it doesn't matter how big or small the organization is, there is a compliance-ready solution to meet those requirements. And, you know, we're not requiring things like any additional printers or, you know, it's all based around your existing infrastructure. All right,
thank you, Chris. I think what we'll do now is highlight some of the resources. And Dan, do you want to go over some of the collateral and information that's available?
Yes, very quickly so we can get to Q&A. I'll just mention there are a lot of great educational resources both on ReadTech's site and on Prism ID's site. So please do visit us and read those blogs, download them. They're great resources for educating yourself. And follow us on social media so you can see new content we're working on as it's published. I'll also invite you, if we don't answer your question during this short Q&A period, please contact us afterwards. We have a lot of questions coming in, and we're just not going to be able to get to all of them. But you do have contact information. We'll be happy to speak with you. And lastly, before we get to Q&A, I'll mention there's an appendix to this slide deck, which you'll receive by email with some reference materials to helpful charts and links around the web. So please do review that when we send it. So now if our panelists are ready, we'll go to our first question. We've gotten a bunch of questions surrounding this topic, so I'm going to summarize them all. And the first question is, what happens after Brexit to EU requirements for the UK? Does EU MDR, and specifically EU UDI, still apply in the UK?
Well, the expectation is that, I mean, right now our Parliament are going through the process of enshrining all of the EU laws into UK law. So the intention is that every single piece of EU legislation that has been put on our EU books is actually going to be on the UK statute books. So we can only assume that the rules that MDR, the regulations that MDR determine are actually going to be carried through and will apply to the UK as well.
Great. So stay tuned on that, but it does sound like you should continue to plan
Assume that they
comply with EU MDR, even if you are only distributing in the UK at present. The next question here is, with the first compliance date more than 2 years in the future, why do we need to be thinking about this now?
Well, thinking about it now, you've got your validation requirements that you need to start thinking about. Now, it's never too early to think about your validation requirements. This is a large, complex project, and a complex which is subject to change in the future years. So as you start to build your requirements for your system, you should be starting to think about and put together your validation master plan on how you intend to use this system and this process within your environment. Now, whilst you're creating this plan, consideration should be made on how you're going to leverage information from the various different suppliers that you will be using. They hold a lot of information. Now, this information can either be documentation, or it could even be persons as subject matter experts which you wish to bring in and leverage those. So the validation cycle, as you would expect, is likely to be very costly. Do not underestimate the cost of your validation cycle. It's going to be resource hungry. It's going to consume resource at a phenomenal rate. Maybe not early in the cycle, but later in the cycle, you're going to be consuming resource from everywhere. It's going to be complex. You need to validate or show or prove that it can be used for intended use within your environment. And it's going to be time-consuming. If you think the validation process is a 2-month little cycle at the end, you may want to think again. It's going to be considerably longer. And it all depends on your validation plan. So securing your potential budget, your resources at an early stage, along with talking to your suppliers who you can leverage, should be able to or will reduce your validation cycle and the time taken. So what you need to do, you need to plan for success, and that starts early.
All right, great. I think that was Phil Dre. So I told you he was out there, and Phil, it sounds like you had that answer locked and loaded. I feel it's not the first time you've had to tell people that.
Indeed not.
All right. We also have several questions surrounding what happens if you don't comply, especially with multiple requirements spread throughout the member states of the EU. What happens if you don't comply by the timelines prescribed?
Shall I take that one, Gary?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. I think there's some details in the regulation and regarding that.
I mean, essentially at the moment, there's the penalties. I mean, that's really what the question is. The question around penalties, Dan?
Yeah. What are the penalties for compliance failures is probably a good kind of summary of the multiple questions we've received on that.
Yeah. So actually, they are actually going to be determined by the individual member states. So they'll lay down the rules for the penalties that are going to be applicable within their countries. Now those penalties that they determine will need to be notified to the European Commission, who will obviously need to approve them. At the moment, actually, none of those penalties have been defined. So the deadline for, or not the deadline, but the measures that are going to be put in place is something like February 2020, around about the time that we will get more information about what those deadlines are going to be. And that's one of the big problems with the EU MDR, is it is still very fluid, it is still very dynamic. Even though the regulations themselves have been published, there's still a lot of things which are being built around it, and this is clearly one of those aspects. So we can't really say what the penalties are going to be, which I guess makes it even more important to make sure that you do it right in the first place.
Absolutely. So it sounds like Phil's answer, plan for success, is sort of the answer to that question too. We don't know the details of the penalties.
Right.
Plan to not need to know.
Yeah. Indeed. Yeah.
We've gotten several questions, and Gary, maybe you can respond to this. We've got several questions about reusing G10s that have been used in the U.S. for EU UDI data submissions, and how does that work? How does it work in the data, and how does it work on the label?
Yeah, that's a real good question. It has come out before. The FDA and the EU are both very much interested in using issuing agencies that have a global presence and governance. So by using a particular item number and identifier, such as the G10, then that particular G10 number, which is a combination of the company identifier and the product, and in some cases it'll have a production identifier, is unique across the globe at all times. So the particular G10 that you use here in the U.S., you're able to use globally, so certainly good for EU as well. In some cases, you may be retiring G10s and then, starting to reassign them. I caution you in regard to that. You want to look at the GS1 policy about making unique numbers and not reusing them. So in regard to the fact that you're able to use the same G10 number for both U.S. sale and for EU sale is able to be done. What you will find, though, is that the labeling design could be quite different. So your FDA U.S. label would not need to have CE mark, for example, and when you go to Europe, obviously the CE mark and other notified bodies, designated representative and so on, would need to be included. So doing a universal label design is really difficult. I've seen some companies try to go down that path, but at least you're able to share the identifier across multiple regions.
Great. So since you mentioned the label, Gary, we've gotten several questions on this. I'll throw this question out to the group. There's a lot of questions surrounding the med device symbol, and Chris, I think you covered that briefly, or at least it was in a bullet list on one of your slides. Can you talk a bit more about that and how that impacts the label in the EU versus the label in the U.S.?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a new symbol which has not yet been fully, it's not yet been fully approved or distributed, what it's going to be, but the expectation is that it will be very similar to this, to the IVD symbol. But an indication of the thing that the label is applicable to is a medical device. I'm not sure whether Gary may know the answer, I'm not sure whether a similar symbol is required for FDA labeling. I believe not. I believe this is something which will be unique to the EU labels.
Yeah, I concur with that. There's not the equivalent of that particular symbol on a U.S. label.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I've gotten a couple questions about this too. I'm trying to cover questions and consolidate them since we have so many. A couple questions about really small devices. I know there are certain exemptions in the U.S. Is there any information about that? Gary, you look like you're nodding like you have something to say there. Is there any information available about exemptions or how that should be handled for very small devices in the EU?
Yeah, so for small devices, FDA does not have a policy statement about excluding it. Now, there is a mention for putting direct marking on very small products, and if it's technically not possible, then you're able to leave that particular identifier off. So if it causes the device to have a change in its efficacy or if it's safety, the FDA does offer that exception. And we see that carry through in the regulation for the EU as well. So for the direct marking of very small devices, those exceptions still apply, that technically infeasible, as well as, concern for safety and efficacy. There are some guidelines for not including the full information. So if you were to go back to the slide looking at the comparison, when space is a concern, the EU does allow some of the components to be left off. So in general, there's a possibility of leaving the human readable off and only including the AIDC portion, so the barcode portion, so that saves some space on the label. And there are special conditions there for home use versus regular physician use in hospital use. So look into the details, but there are some accommodations on the EU side that are not on the FDA side.
Great. I'll just mention we have a friend from GS1 who's attending, and he has sent to me in the comments section, Pete Alvarez, some of you will recognize him, that the same GTIN can be used if the products are in fact the same, as long as the GTIN allocation rules are followed. So that's sort of a succinct summary of the answer to a lot of those questions we've gotten about GTINs. We're a little past the top of the hour, so I'm sorry to say we're going to have to wrap up. We got a lot of questions that we weren't able to answer, so please contact our teams. We will be happy to do our very best to answer your question, you know, over email or over a phone call. We look forward to having you at our next event, and please visit us online, contact us in the meantime. You all have a great afternoon and evening. Take care.